So, welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So, this is episode 79, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Loni Mahanta, who's a VP of policy at Zillow. So, part of Zillow, Loni was a VP of policy at Lyft. So, she has some pretty incredible marketplace experience when it comes to policy and relations. So, this is a really incredible chat with Loni, where we got to learn more about her experience leading policy at Lyft from early stage to IPO. Now at Zillow, some insights on policy and the role it plays with marketplaces, and also had a great group Q&A for those on the chat. So really enjoyed it, and you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Loni, welcome to the group chat, and it's a real treat to have you join us here today. So you have some really incredible experience at marketplaces like Lyft and now at Zillow, along with some specific insights into things we don't get to often chat about, like policy relations and the role those play with marketplaces. So I'm really excited to learn more about it. Before we jump into things, though, I think it'd be great if you can start off by sharing a little bit more on your background for those that don't know you.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. So I'm a lawyer by training, and I would say that in some ways I kind of found myself through the happenstance that a lot of us, find opportunities and kind of move into them. When I was looking to go in-house from the old law firm world, I knew some folks at Lyft, started the conversation and went in there. What I found really quickly is that while I was, in there to work on labor and employment issues, sort of working with internal people team, and the normal employment issues, I was also dealing a lot with the independent contractor versus employee issues that the company was facing. That quickly really took off. And what one that was like, what was of interest to me? I think it was particularly of interest because it was a structural question that the company was dealing with and really needed to think about. And so, as time went on, I was just, handling all the legal ways in which the classification of drivers touched the platform, both externally from a litigation perspective, but also working with our product teams, and helping them think through how to navigate, existing law and things like that. But then pretty quickly, it became clear to me that what the company was dealing with as a legal issue was not really a legal issue. It was a policy or normative question, and really like an operational and business one. It was the way in which we had structured the whole company and really the gig economy more broadly. That became evident as years went on, and we get to like Prop 22 and things like that. But at the time, we weren't structured to think about things in that way. I pitched the founders, and created our Future of Work org. Future of Work means a lot of different things. It means a lot of different things now, but at the time we were sort of talking about the changing American workforce and people moving into sort of 1099 work instead of exclusively thinking about W-2 work as ways to sort of build out their economic lives. So that's sort of, my time at Lyft. I'm now at Zillow. I lead public policy and government relations at Zillow. I'm also a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institute, focusing on tech policy and other marketplace stuff. I am on the board of HopSkipDrive, which is an awesome company. And what else? And I advise a lot of other marketplaces too, just sort of earlier stage companies, sort of thinking through legal and policy stuff. So,
I mean, that's some pretty incredible experience. And it's also really cool to hear about Joanna from HopSkipDrive. And she's a previous group chat guest and, really great. So, you were part of Lyft during an incredible time period where it scaled to become one of the largest ride sharing marketplaces. And I think it's fair to say helped shape, both the future of transportation and work. So, I'm curious to learn more about what policy was like when you joined and, working so closely with the founders then, how their involvement in it and both policy changes as Lyft scaled.
what I think was really interesting about Lyft was that there was an early policy function because we were quasi-regulated and we needed to get set up with, what ended up being called the Transportation Network Company, definition. And in California are regulated by the CPUC. And that was so critical, business critical. So the policy team was invested in very early because without regulation and sort of being allowed to operate in cities and states, the company couldn't exist. So that happened early. you can contrast that with some of the gig delivery companies, which didn't have to get regulated in the same way at the outset. So they was a little bit further on in their trajectories when they started to build out the policy teams. So for Lyft, we knew that we needed, government relations and policy. That was all working on sort of allowing the company to exist, and be regulated. But as time went on, the key issue became not about being allowed to operate, but these questions, these labor questions, and these questions about worker classification and sort of the future of work and things like that. And the way I think about this a lot, I've said this over time, is like the founders set out to transform transportation. They did not intend to be sort of in this question of like the changing American workforce. But they were right there, and they needed to address it, even if that wasn't what their intent was. And so it's like, whether or not they wanted to be there, they were, and they needed to kind of change their perspective and really approach some of those issues much more head on than I think they would have done, if they had sort of had their druthers.
Yeah, certainly. And you mentioned worker classification. So could you share a little bit more about that, and maybe even like AB5?
Yeah. So, in the US, there's tests for whether or not somebody is a W-2 worker or is a 1099 worker. I'm not sure what baseline knowledge people have here, so I'll apologies if you guys are already aware of this. But for a long time, the test was, in most jurisdictions and at most levels, a multi-factor test called the right to control test, which looked at things like, is there a schedule? Are there uniforms? And there's lots of, different elements. And that's what we were operating in California for a very long time. And that's more or less what the tests are like at the federal level for the IRS and the federal minimum, wage laws. But then, in 2018, the California Supreme Court changed the standard by a case law in a decision called Dynamex. Very unusual. You normally don't have law changed by, court opinion in that way. So it wasn't a legislative process. It just like flipped. Then the California legislature took that new law and basically created, instead of having the multi-factor test, there was just a 3-prong test, and you have to meet all 3 prongs, the ABC test. California legislature then said, okay, we're going to take that, codify that, put that into California law, and expand it to make it apply to more things. So that's what AB5 was. And that was sort of California Supreme Court acting, and then the California legislature taking that, enacting it as legislation and expanding it. And so that was sort of an interesting time of like, all of a sudden, these questions about future of work became very different. And at least within the gig space, we really had to spend our time focusing specifically around that issue.
Yeah, I know a lot of us here and that run earlier stage marketplaces, of course, kind of heard about it. But being such a large marketplace like Lyft, right? Like that has a lot of implications to the business. So how do you kind of think about it at the time from like a business side?
I think that one of the most important roles that I personally played in the company was helping the company understand how these things fit together. That they were not disparate questions. You couldn't have product teams thinking about pricing in a market divorced from questions about, minimum wage or minimum earnings, right? Like you find them, they're not employees, but these policies, these normative questions about, what is the right way to set pricing. You could have a position that, whatever the market clearing price for labor is the right way to do it. You could also say that, no, we should think about, what the right minimum earnings standard is, even if they're not employees. And there's not one way to do it, but like helping the company understand how these things that sort of seemed political and external were not political. They were actually fundamental to the business. Eventually that became super clear, and none of this was like controversial, but there was some interim period where, nobody really wanted to be oriented that way. Wanted to just sort of be pure product and kind of focus in that way. But you can't really approach, a hyper growth company that has a lot of impact out in the real world in that way. So I think that would be a big learning, actually.
Yeah. And I guess, what are some like, as you mentioned, learnings, like what are some kind of key learnings from your time at Lyft, maybe that you then took with you to Zillow?
I think there's a couple things I would say. One is that it's important, I think, for earlier stage companies. You have to find the right balance. At some point, it's too early. You don't have the resources for it. You need to kind of know what the baseline law is, follow that, and kind of move forward. But there is also a place where actually understanding how the regulatory structure in which you're operating kind of interplays with the company sooner rather than later is really important. And I think that a lot of times by the time you think about this, you might bring in a GC who's going to be focused on funding and, commercial contracts and things like that. That's all critically important. But understanding the way in which you interact with the kind of regulatory scheme is I think, really important, particularly because regulators at sort of all the levels, at the city, state, and federal levels, are not going to allow companies to kind of go unregulated like they did with the big guys back in the day. Like, I've had so many conversations in Sacramento and DC where policymakers are like, we made a mistake the first time around of letting the big tech companies kind of go through unregulated, and like, we're not making that mistake again. And so that puts, I think, earlier stage companies like needing to think about these things a little bit sooner. Of course, the question is like, when are you really going to resource it? These campaigns, these things are super, super expensive. It's not necessarily going to be the right business model at the outset, but understanding what that regulatory framework looks like sooner rather than later is, I think, really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's actually something that comes up quite often here in the community, which is, being a little bit scrappier early on and maybe not having the resources for like a GC or bringing it, in-house. At what stage is the right time to kind of think about that and start really prioritizing it?
Probably my bias as a lawyer, I'm like, you probably do need somebody that can kind of help you think through stuff earlier. I think law firms have gotten better, but they don't really understand how to get actionable legal advice like really quickly, and like, something is better than nothing. No one wants a memo, just move forward. And so I think for that reason, it's like helpful to have somebody that's like well acquainted with your business. But yeah, I don't know if I think it's probably good. I'll probably bias earlier than others would, but I think it's pretty important if you're kind of in a quasi-regulated space or you have any tricky legal issues that you have somebody that's helping through them with you on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, probably certainly if you're in a ride sharing too, I would say. So
yes, that she was the general counsel who's now the president. She was, I think, employee 4 or something like that.
Yeah. So on that note, as far as like examples of other marketplaces that, what's maybe some other examples of marketplaces and what stage they brought it in-house?
Gosh, I don't know. I'd have to go back and sort of look. What I have found is that there are a lot of companies that I'm talking to right now that I'm helping advise or just think through issues. And I would say that like one of the things that I'm seeing the need for is like, how to get what you need from your outside law firms. So how do you get the law firms to kind of understand like what your need is and sort of like helping on that side? Or if you have somebody that's like, a lawyer by training, perhaps sometimes I'm talking with people who's a head of legal within a company or a GC. They are all of a sudden needing to scale. And so how do you navigate a bunch of different employment laws in a bunch of different states? How do you think about like what the opportunities or risks or managing that with a small legal team? So how you might think through it yourself, and then how you might lean on external resources to kind of help get that. That would be on the legal side. On the political side, once some companies that I'm talking to that need to engage with outside experts, a lot of times what I'm doing is help make connections. Like, here, you might want to talk to this consultant, but also how to use those political consultants, because like they have a totally different worldview of like how they're thinking about what their discipline is. And it's really going to be quite different from how you think about like what you need. So like really forcing the conversation of keeping them on track and getting you what you need. So I think those are the types of things that I'm seeing anyways with the earlier stage companies that I'm talking to and helping.
Got it. That's super helpful. That's probably going to lead to a few questions here when we get to Q&A. So, transitioning into Zillow, what led you to joining the Zillow team?
So I was looking to kind of get into a different space. I'm a labor and employment lawyer by training and had spent all this time in gig, learned a lot, but was like, I want to do something else. What I was looking for was a place where there were interesting and challenging legal and regulatory issues that were critical to the success of sort of the longer term vision of the company. And at the time I was also looking for something that was like, resource, I've been at an earlier stage company. So I was like, let me see what happens if I can go to like start it somewhere a little bit later stage. And I was also looking for, a good culture, and all those things sort of fit when Zillow came up, because the place that Zillow is in is sort of interesting. Even though it's been public for 10 years, they're moving towards trying to create a holistic real estate transaction. And all of that has all these antiquated old rules and laws, real estate laws, that are kind of wrapped around the different pieces that will make it hard to kind of create a seamless digital transaction. So for me, that was sort of like an interesting place to be, of like, there's old, incumbent industry and laws and rules that need to be modernized to make this complicated transaction more simple. So that was like the opportunity. Of course, I'm still learning. I've only been there for a couple months, and then we've had some pretty big news of shutting down our iBuying business, which was pretty big deal, and one of the most disruptive parts of the business. So that's been navigating all of that at the moment.
Yeah, so most of us have probably gone shopping on Zillow, as far as looking at houses recently and favoriting and whatnot, as everyone else during the pandemic. But it might be helpful if you can give us kind of like an overview, though, of maybe Zillow as a marketplace and some of the unique aspects of it that you're working on.
Yeah. So we, and I think I didn't even really know this until I started interviewing, but there's a whole suite of offerings that Zillow provides, right? So from touring of homes to mortgage, to partnering with an agent to find a home to buy, to selling your home to Zillow. And that was the iBuying business that we have just shut down. But then to closing, title, escrow. So all of those pieces, and sort of like how you might fit, how they can create a larger real estate transaction, or a more simple real estate transaction. The marketplace component is probably most akin to the iBuying space, which we have kind of just shut down. But that is like, I would say, where there was like the more matching, a creation of a market. It was interesting. A lot of, we would talk about sort of being a market maker and trying to help make it easier to sell your home and match it effectively with a buyer, and, help smooth that transaction. We're out of that business, but we're still in the business of sort of simplifying the real estate transaction. And so for me, where I sit is like, what are the rules and laws that fit around that? And some of them are weird and in the weeds, like these MLS rules, self-regulating industry. And then some are just these, real estate rules that are meant to protect consumers, but they will also prevent, referring between business lines. So, just trying to help the company understand what those are and what we can do about it if there's old laws that sort of stand in the way of making things better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, not only the existing kind of policies and regulations, but also across so many different markets, right? So, like, how do you kind of, I would say, how do you even like initially approach that?
Yeah, that is the hardest thing, I would say, especially when you're trying to figure out where to resource, is like, how do I navigate all of this at once? And the best advice, which is not going to be a surprise, is just to prioritize. Like, you've got to start like with the matrix of like where you want to launch, what's most important for your business, where your best market's going to be, and how complex or challenging is the legal or political situation there, and kind of cross-reference those things and be like, okay, these are the most important markets. These are the most challenging markets from a political, perspective. How do we then navigate it? Be like, okay, one of the earlier stage company, series B marketplaces that I'm working with right now, they're just like not operating in a couple states because it's just too challenging from a regulatory perspective. And then there's, 2 states where it's like pretty easy from regulatory, so they don't really worry about it. And then there's one where it's like, well, we really need to be in that place, so we're going to like give it a go and maybe put some resources behind it. Because it's important for the business, but not trying to kind of do everything all at once, and really kind of starting with those most important places first.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. So, with Zillow though, like just for a sense of, I would say like kind of resource allocation for policy and regulations, like how big is your team?
I have about 19 people on my team. And so that's in government relations at the federal, state and federal level, and a public policy team.
Oh, wow, nice. And then, what's your day to day like?
I spent a good portion. So I started in July. I spent a good portion of the time just like trying to learn a new industry, learn a whole bunch of new rules and laws that I actually didn't know anything about. I'm not like a real estate person by background. So learning about the industry, learning about, the policy areas, and then learning a new company, that's its own, learning a new big structure is like its own exercise. And then now I'm really in annual planning, helping build out like what we're going to be doing for the next year and budget and sort of all of the things, the more formalized processes that come with working at a, 6,000 person public company.
I wanted to jump into a few different examples of, maybe at Zillow or even kind of at Lyft, some examples of some specific kind of policy issues that you've worked on with marketplaces that might be helpful for us to kind of learn a little bit more about as early stage marketplaces.
I think one of the things that was super interesting was the negotiations that we were in around AB5 before we got to Prop 22. So this speed of like, we gotta, we don't want to be thinking about being like I said, dealing with labor policies a central issue for Lyft, but here we are. We don't have a choice. We got to deal with it. That very rapidly escalated into, okay, now we're in negotiations, but they were not negotiations like a commercial contract, and it wasn't negotiations to settle a legal matter. It wasn't just about money. We were negotiating with the California legislature, with the California governor's office, and with the California labor movement. And so we were thinking about like effectively what a new model to cover, a certain segment of gig work, really, what that might look like. And so that was a very interesting and challenging exercise, in part because the labor movement's not a person. There's lots of different people that we were talking to. And so we had to kind of learn and navigate like, where the real, who we really needed to be talking to. Different people had different opinions about what was an acceptable way to even talk about potential deals or negotiated solutions. The biggest takeaway that one of the most interesting takeaways that I had from all this was, I guess there was two. One was like how important it is to sort of do political power mapping and really understand where the like power where it lays, and sort of like it takes a while to figure that out. And that was a long, complicated process. And the other thing was really just how different the language is between how the tech world talks and where we talk about opportunity and creating new things. That can be received very, very poorly by other parts of the world, right? Be it political, be it labor. But for a lot of people, there is a place of fear. And I would say we probably came in with some hubris, right? Of thinking that like something isn't working and like we can help make it better. And I still believe that that is true, but like really understanding that there's a lot of history behind what we were talking to, and like what was, blood that was shed to kind of create the baseline worker, in employment laws, labor and employment laws. So I think that like a big takeaway, even though I thought that we were coming in, especially the founder that I was working with at the time, even though we were coming in with a lot of goodwill and like really coming in earnestly to try to solve a solution, even that, and we were probably more approachable, I would say, than some of the other players in the gig space. Even with all of that, our language barrier was pretty significant. And so I don't know if you guys are going to be like out there, like, talking to the, to old school labor. But even if you're not, like when you're talking to policymakers, they also come from sort of like a different worldview. And there is something that things that were lost in translation is like a really big takeaway for me.
Yeah, so I'm sure it was incredibly challenging. I'm curious to learn more on that point too. Did you have a lot of collaboration, I would say, with other marketplaces in the space to kind of work together on this, or?
Eventually, yes, it was always an uneasy collaboration because, it's hard enough to kind of keep your own company on track, let alone trying to like agree with other people about every step along the way of a negotiation of like, what does a portable benefits look like? What does an earning standard look like? All of that stuff, we were not in a lockstep agreement with the other players, but we needed to be in some ways. When very, very sadly, after almost 2 years of negotiations failed, which was just heartbreaking, frankly. That's when we went down the Prop 22 road. And that's really when working with the other companies became very much like, okay, we're doing this together. I would say the negotiation stage we were, but it was fairly uneasy engagement.
Just for some context, what point in time was that at?
Which point? Oh, when we were working together. So I would say, let's see. I probably started negotiations in late summer of 2018. And then I guess AB5 probably passed at the end of 2019 and was enacted in 2020.
Wow. So that was a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So we're going to jump into questions here in a little bit because we have a few that messaged me about that. But before we do, so you have some pretty incredible experience here. And then also too, as you mentioned, working with some earlier stage marketplaces and like Series B. Is there any kind of like specific tips that you'd like to share with us, maybe that as far as thinking about policy for early stage marketplace founders and kind of teams?
I mean, I think we've probably touched on it. I think the biggest things are understand the regulatory framework sooner. There was a company that I was advising that ended up folding shop, turning things in and going home, unfortunately, in part because of the regulatory structure around it and sort of the engagement with labor that was not really going where it needed to go. But I think like as a founder, as a CEO, or somebody that's dealing with the legal and policy issues, like make sure you understand how it fits, what the risk is and sort of what the opportunity is. I don't think you can like wait to deal with that stuff later. Like you need to understand how it impacts like how you've set up your business. You can decide what you do about it. That's, you can maybe decide about it later, but like understand what it is. Don't think that it's like a thing that doesn't have to be dealt with, because, if you get to the scale that you want to get to, you will be dealing with it.
I know that's great. Cool. Hey, Ethan, do you want to jump on?
All right. I know no one has a crystal ball. Now you hear my kid too. No one has a crystal ball or anything like that, but where do you think things go with AB5 and around the country? It's, I know no one knows, but like, do things change within our own industry, or do you think things will get changed from a legislative, perspective eventually?
I would say this. I think that there were a lot of people that were really trying to work hard collaboratively behind closed doors for very many years. I think that the issue has true believers on both sides, and it has also become deeply politicized. And because it is so front and center on the politicization side of things, it is, I think it probably will kind of continue along like the blue-red state lines. And in blue states, we'll kind of continue to see a push, I think that the focus of worker classification around tech, even though misclassification is a thing, is like exists in so many different industries, trucking, and when trucking was regulated and all that stuff. But tech is like, it's part of the common conversation now. And so because we're connecting kind of techlash issues with labor issues, I don't think that I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. And I don't think it's necessarily going to get easier. So I suspect that like, especially in blue states, it will kind of continue along the kind of fractious world path that we're seeing.
That was helpful. I could follow up with a million other questions too, if other people don't have questions, but I want to give other people time.
Yeah, we got a little bit of time.
Okay. I'm just curious also just around like misclassification, outside of like the different factors in like the tests, were there processes or tools that you all used at Lyft to like make sure that people that like things weren't misclassified or like subject to misclassification, or that either you used at Lyft or that startups and marketplace startups should be kind of looking into?
That's a great idea. Maybe I should go try to start that. No, we like built processes, like super just like, oh man, I would like educate, some product managers and like, okay, they knew things. And so they would kind of flow things down, but then they'd leave or they'd move to a different area and things would get lost. And then I'd hear about something happening somewhere else and I'd go run it down and try to be like, wait, can we talk about like how you set that up? And it was very manual. We tried, eventually we kind of like put together some materials, training materials, and then also some frameworks for PMs, primarily PMs. I would say that I focused on product first, but then it also became clear that like what GMs, general managers, out in the field were doing things that were potentially problematic. And so we kind of needed to kind of get educational materials out to them as well. So I have not personally seen anything that's like a kind of out of the box thing. Other than to say that when I'm talking to GCs now, my advice is like, try to put some stuff in writing, some framework for your business sooner rather than later, and start the process of like having it be everybody's responsibility to kind of transmit that information. I think that kind of goes even more broadly beyond misclassification to sort of how you integrate legal review into product. And when you build that in as sort of a formalized process, because I think that like those things can get out of step fairly quickly unless the company chooses to stay on top of it.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you.
That is a great idea. Yeah, Loni, I was actually kind of curious on that note too, myself, how much education to some of the PMs as far as, regulation took place?
A lot, because I think that without the baseline understanding, it's very easy for it to look like the lawyer is coming in and saying no on, or like, doing an overly sensitive risk analysis. And you're like, I promise you, I'm trying to help the company do, but we're trying to like not take on excessive risk. But unless you help people understand like what you're talking about, it doesn't make sense to people. You're like, why are you asking me about like a scheduling thing? Why are you making such a big deal about something that's going to like optimize the platform so much? You really have to explain why you're talking about it in the first instance. Otherwise it doesn't make sense. And PMs are smart people. They're going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. And if I don't understand what you're talking about, I'm not going to listen to you.
Yeah, certainly. And then we actually had a question someone posted in the community earlier, which is about the instant payouts that you worked on at Lyft. Mm-hmm. And, maybe some of the kind of, I would say like considerations that you had to take in mind from a policy and kind of regulation side when you implemented that.
Yeah. I would say that by the time that was like, I was thinking a lot about it, I was more in the policy world than I was in the legal world. And so from the policy world, I was like, this is great. This is helping people understand that one of the things that we provide is real-time access to earnings, effectively real-time access to earnings. And that is what is missing from the political conversation around W-2, maintaining W-2 environment is like, that is a set schedule, that is a biweekly pay schedule, and people want and need something different. That is why people are driving on the Lyft platform, at least, pre-pandemic world. And this, demonstrating how much instant payout, how much people use it and how valuable it was proof of like what we were doing sort of in this economic development space.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Hey, Davey, do you want to jump on?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Loni. Thank you very much for all the insights. I have a question that's probably related to everything you said before, but I just wanted to clarify this. As a startup founder, when we think that we're about to disrupt an industry, and probably there's going to be happy people, but people are not happy at all, what approach should we take in terms of steps from a legal perspective? What would you advise on this? And what kind of resources or metrics should we have in order to also back ourselves and showing that this is actually something that can be good more than it can be bad?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a great question. I might like write a blog post about this or something. I think that, first steps you need to try to find, if you don't have an in-house legal person at this point, you need to find a law firm to help you understand what exists today. But you probably want to like talk to some friends, talk to people maybe that are in your space or an adjacent space to be like, hey, is there anybody that is creative and kind of give concise information quickly? Cause like, you really don't want to go to an expensive law firm that's going to give you a long memo that doesn't really help you understand what you're dealing with. So you'll need to kind of find somebody, at the outset that can help you understand what exists. But that honestly won't be enough, because when you're about to disrupt, it's not the lawyers. Often law firm lawyers, and I'm speaking as for myself too, back when I was one, look at kind of what exists in the present, not necessarily how you got to that place or what it would take to change or what change looks like. And so you'll also like want to spend time being like, who are the incumbent players, understanding what their, power structures are, who's going to be pissed off, who are they connected to, like kind of trying to build out the framework of like exactly who's in your space, like really who are you disrupting, and then how do they connect to kind of the legal and political, and then kind of going down the road of like, okay, how much will they be able to stop us? Because if you get traction, they will try to stop you. And so you need to be sort of thinking about and preparing for that with outreach to, your local electeds. You need to kind of start to build out some of that, because the like straight disruption that like Uber got to do, I don't know if that's going to happen anymore. People are like wise to it. They kind of jump in sooner. So like you have to start a little bit earlier than even maybe they did, 15 years ago.
Thanks a lot. And from this workforce perspective, it's like Lyft, Uber, it's a different type of business model regarding the workers that you have. You just get people paid per task. What kind of argument can we use in order, if for those people who are going to build like marketplace like this, what argument have you used to make your case like legitimate in this industry?
Which type of workers?
With like temporary workers, I would say, or workers that are going to be paid based on the task. So there's not like really a proper salary you have every month. It's more based on what you're gonna do, basically.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight to share on this, and what kind of argument you use that make this work and help to with all the policies and stuff?
So a couple things come to mind. So one is the people that are in the know on this stuff immediately, at least the way you just said it, they're going to think of piece rate work. And that was work that was done like a long time ago, like garment workers, and there was a lot of labor and employment law that was built up around piece work. And so there is a construct. We don't talk about it very much these days, but like there is a construct back in the day that like for people that are in their know, they're going to think about that. How that relates here to you is like, while, pay for task can be really good and flexible, and a lot of people will want it because it'll fit in with their lives in a better way, which might be one way to talk about the opportunity that you're providing. You also need to think about it on the other side about like what it means for minimum wage, and like, are you thinking about how much time somebody is spending on the work, and is that going to even meet, the minimum wage standards? Because, are you going to be choosing to like fight about whether or not minimum wage is appropriate? I suggest you don't fight that battle from a business perspective, and also my own, personal belief. But, that is sort of, I think one of the intersections that you'll have to think about is like, when it's pay for work, how does that interplay with minimum wage? On the value side, if you can demonstrate like how people are doing this, like why people want it, what is valuable to people from a work perspective, why would they want to be doing this with like real proof points? That's some of the one pager that you can kind of be putting together to explain why this is useful for people in a good model.
Thank you very much.
That's a really great question. Hey, Loni, on that note, have you seen kind of like earlier stage marketplaces kind of put together those kind of one pagers, just like almost as like an exercise, like really early on to kind of construct that and that framework and their thoughts around it? Or
no, but I really strongly suggest that you do. I think it's a really important way to help a policymaker in particular, like understand what you're doing. They all kind of sound the same. There's so many companies, policymakers don't really know how to think about how to differentiate one from another. So like real proof points, if you have data to kind of demonstrate like what average earnings are, or how many people are working in your marketplace, in this jurisdiction, or the types of people, then plus some actual specific stories of like somebody that's using your platform in a way that maybe they wouldn't have thought about. Those humanizing stories, I think, are really important, and just kind of having it be the way you talk about what you're doing, and not just about disruption, right? Like we want to disrupt, and perhaps we like see the value in disruption, but like disruption sounds scary for other people. So reframe is like what you're doing for the benefit of individuals, of consumers, of whomever.
Yeah, sounds like a resource I need to create for the community. So.
No, lots of ideas coming out of this.
Seriously. Yeah, so I did want to bring up something. I was doing some research for the prior to the group chat, and you gave a previous chat to the Brookings Institute, which is really great. But you specifically mentioned on supply versus on demand and the terminology, and I wanted to chat about that here with the founders and the community.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think that like a way that I think about this a lot is like it's not about demand. When we're now talking about the labor question and about work, it's not about demand. Demand is something that comes from the like consumer side, right? This is actually about the individual being able to provide the work when they want to. They're the ones that are in control of when the work happens. So in some ways, the terminology we should be using is not like on demand, it's on supply. Like that's never gotten anywhere. So, but to me, that conceptually makes so much more sense. That's what the value proposition here is. And that's like, which frankly, I didn't get as much traction as I wanted to, but I'm like, look, even a good minimum wage shifted Starbucks job is a shifted Starbucks job. You still have to show up for that work. You do not have the ability to not show up. On supply work, you get to choose if you come or don't come. And that has real value for people's lives. And we needed to demonstrate that value. That does not even on its own answer the full public policy questions, because there's still real questions about precarity of work and like if people are making enough money for if they choose to be on the platform full time. So there are other challenging questions that are still out there. But I think that demonstration of like people that are in control of when the work happens themselves, that is a real value proposition that, it's kind of shifting that a little bit.
Yeah, I thought that was really great. A great kind of term, and it definitely kind of struck a chord with me. And just thinking through like what's the kind of value prop to our suppliers, right, as marketplaces. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that is like one of the lenses too, right? Which is like when you're a double-sided marketplace, how are you talking about the opportunity you're providing for both sides?
Certainly, versus speaking to one. So
yeah.
Hey, Ethan, do you want to come back on with the?
Yeah. You mentioned like the opportunity to both sides just now. So like when you all and Uber and kind of created instant payouts years back, it almost became table stakes for the industry, where it's hard to compete for talent unless you can offer that. Do you see? I mean, I think we're also kind of seeing like with the Great Resignation and people coming back, especially at the lower rungs, like getting wage increases and demanding more to come back to work. Do you see the labor market like getting increasingly competitive, and like, do you anticipate beyond instant pay companies having to offer additional perks, whether it's a financial benefit, whether that's, healthcare, whether it's like a bank account or access to like small dollar loans or whatever it might be? Do you see that it's trending this way, or do you think it's not actually trending that way?
I over Thanksgiving, had a lot of conversations with my young 20-something cousins who are, leftist and talking about like anti-work movements. And it was super illuminating. And I'm sure I sounded like an old, capitalist, whatever over on my side over here. But it was really interesting. And what we talked about is like, there is power in workers deciding what people do or do not want to do. And, I think that's like really what we're seeing in the Great Resignation, of people sort of being like, I'm not going to tolerate what used to be. that's an upward pressure that I think would be ultimately beneficial for, for the gig world too, in terms of like raising standards. One of the things that I remember talking with at a think tank thing I went to, an Aspen Institute thing I went to in DC, with a lot of people from the labor movement. And they were very skeptical, very critical, which I wasn't surprised by. But I was like, look, put Lyft out of business because teachers are being paid enough money. Like, we all want to be in a place where teachers are being paid enough. Like, people, and if Lyft is a place where people are making that supplemental income, why are you taking away the thing that's helping instead of like solving the root cause? So, is that going to be a type of thing where we're like, all the wages are kind of upward pressure on wages? I suspect yes. But in terms of the additional benefits, I think, at least for the Lyft and Ubers of the world, the ancillary benefits are not what are as important. It's really about earnings and like the baseline earnings coming up. That's from my own research of like, when we were doing all these things to be like, what are the other supplemental things that we could provide, especially when you divorce it from the policy conversation and more, we're just like, what do the individuals, when we survey people, what do they say that they want? And candidly, it wasn't enough of those ancillary things for Lyft to build all of that other stuff ourselves. We had conversations about it, but it didn't make sense for us to build it. I think that there's a possibility that partnering with other companies that build those things, if you can show that it drives retention in some way. There's two ways that you could like think about it. Does it drive retention, or does it beneficially a part of the policy conversation? Without one of those two, like, I don't necessarily know, but I suspect that like those ancillary benefit type things are not as important in the gig world as they are for W-2 employment. And even in W-2 employment, I don't think it's like retirement that people care about, even though everyone needs retirement. It's like, how much am I earning? How much am I working? Do I have paid leave when my child gets sick?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful.
Hey, Loni, so I'm kind of curious to learn more about you. You mentioned as far as some of the kind of data points and surveying users and whatnot. So you have the existing data kind of like outside the walled garden of your marketplace, right? So like, how much are you like surveying your users and then kind of relating that to other data to kind of support some of I would say like your decision making and the policies and whatnot?
I would say that was sort of bifurcated within the company. The way product teams would look at what they should be doing to like think about retention, and reducing churn. I was not a product person, so I don't know exactly like how they did that. I do know there's a lot of surveys and there'd be different teams that would sort of do information out there, look at information. And then I suspect that they also correlated with externally sourced data. On the policy side, I feel like we rarely got to be so scientific. We kind of had to go with like where the political conversations were taking us, even if it's not entirely what we thought was like the right thing to do. And so a good example of that, I think, is retirement. Every policymaker knows that like nobody is saving enough for retirement. Nobody is. But was it on us? Like when we have individuals who are driving on the platform, they're not saying we want to be saving for retirement, right? Like they're like, I need the money now for whatever that is, right? It's like, I need the money for rent, or I need the money because I'm saving up to go do something fun, like whatever it is, they're not thinking about it for retirement. And so I'm like, okay, so policymakers want us to create some retirement fund. The drivers don't say that they want it, but nobody says that they want it. What does that mean for us? Like as a company, like how much should we be investing in that? If that had been like, there probably were more things that could have been done in that. I mean, there were definitely more things that could have been done in that space, but it was sort of an interesting question, I think, for a platform to consider, like, what's the right thing to do when we have those sort of conflicting inputs?
That's a really great example. Yeah, that has me thinking about it a little bit more. So, well, cool. So we're almost out of time here. I did have one kind of last question for you, though. Knowing what you know now, if you were to kind of go back and when you first joined Lyft, kind of what would you tell yourself?
The things that you're seeing, you're not wrong. what you are seeing is happening. It's real. It's important. Keep pushing on it.
That's great. It's definitely worked and gotten you to where you are today. So cool. Well, thanks again for taking the time to join us for the chat today. This is incredibly insightful. So we definitely appreciate it. And yeah, thanks everyone for the great questions. But right before we wrap it up, though, before I forget, where can we keep up with you? Time for a little quick plug.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much of a presence, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to kind of help. And we, if I can be useful, feel free to shoot me a note at Loni@LoniMahanta.com. And I'm also going to be doing some more work with Brookings. So if you've got interesting ideas or questions that you think I should, explore, shoot them my way. I'd love to hear.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, and we'll definitely do that.
Thanks so much. This is super fun.